Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Wandering Road podcast. I'm your host Chris, alongside my co-host Dean. And for today's episode, we are going to be talking about one of my favorite exorcism cases. I would say this is my number one. If you had to give me like a list of top five, this would be number one. And the reason being is because I love the movie The Exorcist. I read the book The Exorcist multiple times by William Peter Blatty. For those of you that are not familiar with this case, the book and the film are based off of this exorcism and the experiences that the priests and the family and Roland went through at the time.
Your mother cucks socks in hell.
Oh my
You
god.
remember?
I remember that line where he's talking to the one younger guy, right? The one younger priest.
Oh well, okay. So the in the you might have to bleep this out, but in the movie, it's your mother sucks in hell. However, what I referenced was Aqua Teen Hunger Force, the episode when the little gerbil was infested by a demon, and in order to get that line on the air, they switched it. It said your mother cucks socks in hell, and that's how they got it on the air. So whatever cucksing socks like you wear on your feet, that whatever that is, that's how they got it on the air. And it's just, I think about that every time I hear about The Exorcist, I always think about that Aqua Teen Hunger Force episode.
When I say Exorcism of Roland Doe or I mention The Exorcist to you, like what are your initial thoughts about this topic?
I mean, what crosses my mind first for sure is, I mean, everybody thinks about the movie, obviously, but for me personally, I think about the movie first, and then I immediately think about the gravity of it. You know, a child being possessed by like a demon or the devil or whatever. And when I was younger and I would hear about The Exorcist, I would like avoid it because it always bothered me deep down. But here's the thing: after doing deep research into this case, I'm not so nervous about it anymore because there are a lot of layers to it. And clear that a lot of stuff in the movie was amplified and just plain made up, you know, from the regular story. Like the regular story has a lot of the same dynamic. We'll get to this, like the possession, you know, the contorting, the inexplicable strength of the child, marks in the skin showing up and vomiting black vial, like all that stuff apparently happened in the real case. In
What
terms of
didn't
like,
happen was the head
yeah,
twisting thing.
yeah,
That is
obviously.
not that did not happen.
The devil can't not do that to you because you will literally break your neck. That's what I find so interesting about this, especially in the parts of the story, the true story based on the real story, where the kid starts getting lacerations and carvings in his skin, which we'll go into more detail about. That's probably the freakiest part of the story to me. But there are other aspects which, you know, I'll share my real view on this at the end. I'll save it for the end. But I do think it's a little bit weird or strange that the kid supposedly ended up in a psychiatric ward where the priest had performed the exorcism. I am excited to dive into this, but I'm going to flip it. Like, okay, like this is your chance to shine, Chris, because you are such a big proponent. You've talked about The Exorcist a million ways to Sunday. So this is your chance. Share everything you feel about it. Like, what are your thoughts on it? What's your thoughts about the case?
My first thought on the case is that it involves a Ouija board.
Ah,
Just
yes.
just like the film. So if you watch the film and in the book as well, I believe it's been like shit. What year is it? 2025. I read the book in 2018, so it's been a little while. But anyway, the Ouija board in the beginning is very important to this. And when I think about this case, I'm like, it just pinpoints all of the dangers that could happen when you deal with, I guess, the paranormal or the occult. Do you want to call it the occult? I wouldn't say it's the occult. I guess dabbling in spirituality or with the spiritual realm, not really knowing what you're doing, I would say. I think
But
that's like the big red flag.
But what's so interesting about this story is that looking into this in depth, it seems like, and we'll get into this right now, but like the aunt, so Aunt Tilly, I'll let you tell the initial story, but just to reference, the aunt is the one who passed away, who left the Ouija board behind when she passed. And then this kid, a Roland Doe, he finds it and then he tries to contact his deceased aunt. What's interesting is it doesn't seem like there's any Catholic or Christian injection into what Aunt Tilly was doing because she was called a spiritualist. in all the
Yep.
research. Like, there was nothing about her teaching Roland. He would partake and participate in this stuff with his aunt and basically kind of like, believe in it and want things to happen, just like I'm sure any young kid would want. They want to see some magic or something like that. But Aunt Tilly never seemed to push a Christian faith or background. It was always like a new age spiritualist view, which is also fascinating because it was 1949. Not a lot of spiritualism but the reason why I find this so crazy is it ultimately led to Catholicism and the devil, the biblical devil. It's crazy that it went that way. Like, and I'll say one more thing before I flip it back. I think that there are elements to the story that might suggest that you could potentially look at it through the spectrum of any religion. Doesn't have to be Christianity or Catholicism. Like, what if there was some other type of demon from some other genre in the world or some other religion, or even just like extraterrestrials inhabiting a body to fuck with people? Like, who knows what? But there's so many things that you could fill the gap on about what was really going on, just because you skipped from new age spiritualism to the devil and Christianity, all through this advent of using a Ouija board after his aunt died. So I don't know. Like, do you have a take on that? Or maybe just go into however you want to go into, if you want to go into the story, or just respond. It's up to you, man.
I'm glad you brought up spiritualism. Spiritualism in 1949 was not prominent, but the spiritualist movement reached its largest following in the 19th century, like mid to late 19th century.
Okay.
And it kicked off, and that's where you had the seances come about and all these other things. So I wouldn't be surprised if Aunt Tilly was involved in that in
Yeah.
some shape or form.
Yeah.
But I'll go ahead and jump right in and kind of set the stage. So we're going to call him Roland Doe throughout the episode. That's not his real name.
One source said Robbie Mannheim, Mannheim, and that
Yes.
source was the Skeptical Inquirer in 2021. So December 2021 is when they claimed that they found the true name. But then there's another name,
Ronald Edwin Hunkler, which was
Hunkler.
yeah,
Yeah.
claimed by the Skeptical Inquirer. But we just wanted to throw that out there real quick, but we are still going to go with the name Roland Doe just because it's been so attached to this case for so long that when you say the exorcism of Roland Doe, most people that are invested in the paranormal know exactly what you're talking about. So Roland grew up in a German Lutheran family. He was an only child, so that being the case, he depended on adults, to play around with him. And that is where you enter in Aunt Harriet, also known as Aunt Tilly. And what did we say earlier about Aunt Tilly? Aunt Tilly had spiritualist interests. Aunt Tilly played a pivotal role in the life of Roland Doe and the events that would follow, referring to the exorcism. She played a role introducing him into quote unquote occult practices. So Aunt Tilly was known within the family as an eccentric figure deeply involved in spiritualism, a movement, like I said, that gained popularity in the 19th and early 20th century. She had a very strong belief in the supernatural, the afterlife, and drumroll, communicating with spirits. Apparently, she was very skilled in using tools such as the Ouija board. For those of you that don't know what a Ouija board does, it allegedly allows you to speak with the spirit world. While she may have practiced other occult traditions, those really aren't clear. So that's just all up to speculation. So her relationship with Roland, she did have a very close bond with him. She was a maternal figure to him in the sense that, she was around him all the time. They were very close. And like we said, Roland was an only child. So obviously, if you have a family member that you're very close to, you're going to be attached to them all the time. And this happened to be Aunt Tilly, who happened to be involved in spiritualism and happened to be involved with the occult. And by proxy, Roland would see his aunt, doing these things, messing with a Ouija board.
Can
They
I say real
would,
quick? This
yeah, go
this
ahead.
is crazy. This is so crazy. This is so worth mentioning that I think a lot of people might find really interesting. Cottage City, Maryland is actually right on the border with the District of Columbia, Washington, DC, and it
No
looks like
way.
it's less yeah, it's, like, less than a couple miles from the White House, supposedly. Like, this point that I found, Cottage City, Maryland, it says right here, Google, it's like it's the only one that is listed in Maryland. I'm not saying that has any the fact that it's near DC has anything to do with it. I just think it's interesting geolocationally. You're talking about being very close, growing up very close to a city center where you're the capital of the US. So, the other thing too that's interesting that I already knew about that I wanted to mention when you brought up the Ouija board is for people who don't know, we had another episode we talked about this. So go give it a listen if you want more in-depth knowledge about the Ouija board. But so what's interesting about the Ouija board is it was actually patented in Baltimore in 1890, but it was invented in 1886 in Chestertown, Maryland, which is only about an hour and a half drive away from, the supposed events of Roland and Cottage City, Maryland. So I think it's so interesting to me that all those things kind of coalesced around that area or like in that part of Maryland slash DC.
No, I think it's really interesting you brought that up, that it was invented so close. And one could assume that maybe Aunt Tilly was around at the time when it was invented, or fairly young when,
Yeah.
it was just popular and getting out there,
Yeah.
close exposure to it. But to continue with Roland and his relationship with Aunt Tilly, Roland being a little kid, kids are naturally curious. Kids are very impressionable. If you're doing something that seems remotely interesting, you have a child, they're going to come over and try to figure out what the hell you're doing. And 9 times out of 10, what do they want to do? They want to do it too. So here we have Roland, who's hanging out with his aunt a lot, who's into the
Impressionable.
occult, who's very
Yeah.
impressionable, doing Ouija sessions. He's like, hey, what is this, Aunt Tilly? I want to do this too. This seems really interesting. And of course, she obliged, and that led to them engaging in Ouija sessions together.
Yeah. So after all those sessions where she's dealing or she's teaching this kid how to deal with the Ouija board and how to do stuff, what's the next critical point that happens in this kid's life? Because he's so close to her and she shows him how to do all this stuff. And he believes in the other side, presumably. What happened? What's the big catalyst?
In early 1949, Aunt Tilly unexpectedly passes away, which
She
had
probably would
a
have been young too, right? She like if
probably.
she's yeah, like maybe in her even her like 40s could be. So she died sounds like unexpectedly.
Yeah, so if she died unexpectedly, let's ballpark, she was probably in her mid 40s or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, like when you lose someone close to you, like as a kid, like I've said before, I lost my grandparents when I was a teenager, who I was with literally all the time from when I was born. It really, really has a deep psychological effect on you. Like
Yeah.
you don't know how to cope. This was probably his first run in with death, like real
Good
death
point.
for the first
Very
time.
good point. Yeah.
So he probably does not know how to process this. And after she passes away, he has all of this knowledge that she passed down to him. And what's the next obvious thing you think? I believe he would have been what? A teenager at the time. So if he was
Yeah.
born in 35, he would have been 15, 14,
Yeah, 14,
14.
yeah.
Yeah. So he'd have been 14 years old. And you're going into your teen years, your mid teen years, you're starting to get rebellious. You're like, I want to do what I want to do. He decides he's going to start using the Ouija board by himself. And who do you think he's going to try to contact? He's not going to try to contact just random spirits that he was probably doing with Aunt Tilly years before when he was younger. He tries to contact Aunt Tilly. We don't know if he actually contacted Aunt Tilly, but based off of what starts to happen next, I would say he contacted something more malevolent. Throughout the case, you get to the exorcism, and priests make the claim that it was actually the devil that possessed him, that was causing him this all types of distress. So, could have been a random demon that came through the board, an angry spirit, or as they claim, it could have been the devil himself.
I feel like we talked about this at one point with maybe like JJ and whatnot, but isn't it true that like in the actual belief of Catholic exorcism, like because they do practice, like for it's like it's documented. They have like an arm or whatever where they do exorcisms, and it's rare. Is it not true that they say that the devil himself or the devil's self would ever possess somebody? Like it's really, really, really rare. Like most of the cases of documented exorcisms, it's like some lesser demon or something like that. So like I could be wrong about that, but I feel like we talked about that before, and that's probably something to mention in this because it's like, you're getting targeted by the penultimate like leader of hell in the in the Christian Catholic faith, but like that's kind of a heavy concept to think about too. This poor little 14-year-old boy being targeted not just by like any old, lesser rank demon. He's actually being focused on by the devil, like the antithesis of God, and that's crazy to me because like wow, like why first of all, why, and like how frequent is that where the Catholic Church actually says this exorcism wasn't just a demon, it was the devil. So that's crazy to me. Portions of the Catholic Church or the priests who were involved, at least one of them believed that it was the devil.
I think we did talk about that with JJ briefly when we did the episode on Ouija boards.
There you go, another good reason to go listen to our episode on Ouija boards. Hint hint, sell.
Yeah, right? But we didn't do a deep dive on this topic yet.
No.
So, to recap, he's distraught. He lost his favorite aunt. Him being an only kid, doesn't know how to deal with the grief. He starts playing with the Ouija board. He tries to reach out to Aunt Tilly. Him and the family think that he's successfully reaching out to Aunt Tilly because during these Ouija board sessions, weird things started to happen. You had unusual noises, you had random scratching and tapping, objects started moving on their own. And it was at that point the family believed that Aunt Tilly, her spirit, was reaching out to them. It's like, oh, this is working. So there is proof, that there is an afterlife. After he starts messing with the Ouija board, we start having behavioral changes in Roland. He starts having violent outbursts. He starts having extreme tantrums. His body starts bearing unexplained scratches and welts. Some of the scratches would form words like help.
The initial stages of all this, I think one thing that stood out to me the most was the stuff flying across the room early on. I know that happened too, like later on in the stories, according to some accounts. There was also like a dripping sound that took place initially that caught the family's attention. I had a hard time confirming this, but supposedly based off of some of the things I've read, the family reached out, to plumbers and stuff like that, and nobody had any answer for them. So they just ignored it. They thought they had a leak. And then suddenly it starts turning into tapping and rapping and scratching. And eventually the sounds kind of migrate to Roland's room. And then the culmination is obviously the bed shaking, things happening that are inexplicable. And then you get on to the scratches and stuff showing up on his body. So this was very much a progression of events happening in the home. And I think it's worth highlighting because it's just interesting as hell that the family, like you said, was Lutheran, right? So they had a belief in Christianity. But it sounds to me like the mother was the one who was ready to accept very rapidly, very quickly, that there was something supernatural going on. She's the one who started reaching out for help. What's crazy to me is eventually, after things got so bad, you have a Lutheran woman who sounds like she's at least somewhat spiritual, if not a lot spiritual, reaching out for help or reaching out to, to anybody.
Like we said, the family experienced strange noises. Roland is acting up in weird fashions. He's having these marks on his body. He's throwing tantrums. Maybe the tantrum is a manifestation of his grief. Who knows? But the family doesn't know what to do. So, like we said earlier in the show, they're a Lutheran family. So naturally, they turn to their Lutheran pastor, Luther Miles Schultz. Schultz had an interest in parapsychology. So, what did he do? He arranged to have the boy spend the night in his home to observe him. While Roland spent the night there, Schultz claimed that he witnessed household objects and furniture moving by themselves. After that incident is when Pastor Schultz tells the family, y'all need to go see a Catholic priest. I am wiping my hands clean of this. There's nothing I can do to help you. Your kid was here, spent the night, and all my fucking furniture started moving by itself. I started hearing weird fucking noises.
My
I
cat burst into flames.
flames.
My wife left me. I mean, granted, I lit my cat on fire and my wife hated me for that, but no, it's just like it all stemmed from this one guy. That's so funny. Like,
Yeah, it just doesn't it, I don't know what that means. Like what it proves. It's like, okay, maybe Catholicism are more powerful. Like who knows? Like what's that insinuating?
and also that, yeah, also the guy thought that too, because you didn't say he was Catholic. He didn't present himself as Catholic. So like, it's interesting that he sold that.
You know, them being devout Lutherans their entire life. They
Yeah,
go to one of their religious leaders, and their religious leader is like, "Nope, I ain't helping you."
that's okay. If it really happened, that would be pretty strange to me too. And I feel like I've heard stories like that in the real world before, though, where it's like, okay, I'm Lutheran, I believe in, or like I'm a certain practicing belief, a sect of Christianity, and I believe certain things about Jesus and teachings, like, or it can be any religion really. But then if you're dealing with something where they don't have a doctrine, like I don't think it's just speculation. I would imagine he would do that because they didn't have a doctrine. He didn't have a doctrine to turn to for exorcisms. Kind of like reminds me of the idea of like different jobs for different situations, but like you could be part of the same, like let's say you're a mechanic and you work on cars, but then you come across this car that you have never worked on and it's from like Croatia, and like oh you need to go down the street to this other like specialty mechanic where they can like fix the rotor or some some shit like in this car that I've never worked on. That's what I think of if the situation is real. The flip side is if the situation is bullshit, we'll get into later what could be going on. I'll save that for later.
With regards to Lutherans and exorcisms, I'm not fully knowledgeable, but with Lutherans, it kind of depends. I mean, some of them don't believe in demons, and then you have
Oh,
some
that's
of
right.
some
Yeah,
Lutheran churches that do believe in them,
yeah.
and they
We've
do
talked
have
about
like
this.
certain prayers. Yeah, they do have certain prayers that they will use to cast out demons and perform their version of the exorcisms. So it
Mhm.
might have been the case that with his specific church that the family went to, they probably didn't believe in
Have a
demons.
Yeah, have
Or yeah,
access to it or understand what was going on, which is weird too, because like if you didn't believe in demons and you had some kid spend the night at your house, you could evaluate him. Which, by the way, that's kind of a weird thing to me in and of itself, where like, if he doesn't believe in this stuff, why is he watching this kid so closely? Maybe he had suspicions about what was going on, but if you have weird shit happening in your house and you don't believe in demons in the first place and you don't have any way to fight them off in your faith, it just seems so out of place to me that you'd be like, "Oh, go to the Catholic priest. They know, they're the special forces of demonology. Like, what? You better go talk to them." I feel like we're driving this too far into the grounds. What's the next big turn of events after they get turned to the Catholic Church?
so they get referred to the Catholic Church, and that is when they seek the assistance of the Catholic clergy. So Roland's family ends up consulting a priest to investigate. Edward Hughes, a Roman Catholic priest from the Jesuit institution at Georgetown University Hospital. The story goes that Roland underwent quite a few exorcisms. Edward Hughes was the one that conducted said exorcisms. And I think JJ told us this story before when we talked about exorcisms and the Ouija board, and we briefly brought up the Roland Doe case, in which during one of the exorcisms, he got loose of his restraints and pulled out a bed spring from the mattress and then used it as a weapon to slash the priest's arm,
Mm,
nearly having him bleed to death, forcing the ritual to be stopped. So
yeah.
we have the failed exorcism attempts at the Jesuit institution with Edward Hughes. And that's when the family decides to venture to St. Louis, Missouri. And the reason for that is because Roland's mom was from there. So they thought a change of scenery would probably help the situation. And that is when we enter in the other set of clergymen with Father Raymond J. Bishop and Father William S. Bowden, who were experienced Jesuit priests, and these were the primary figures involved. So the two priests, or the two fathers, observed Roland's behavior and unexplained phenomenon. Then they sought permission from the Catholic Church to perform an exorcism. They received approval for the ritual from the Archdiocese of St. Louis. So I'm assuming that the other diocese in which I believe it was Edward Hughes, we said, conducted his exorcism, he had permission from the Archdiocese, because anyone listening to this, correct me if I'm wrong, but you need permission from the diocese in order to perform a ritual of exorcism. So it's not like there's just one overall diocese you go to, like it's localized. You could have had a situation where this archdiocese would have been like, this kid is mentally unstable, like he needs medical attention. Whereas the other diocese, when he was in Maryland, was like, no, we have to do this. So it really isn't what I want to say. Not every archdiocese is going to view the case in the same way. I just wanted to throw that out there.
That'd be an interesting statistic to find out, right? Like how often do archdioceses get requisitions for or requested, like, for exorcism? Like, it'd be so funny. Like, if you could do like statistical analysis, be like, okay, so for every 10 or every 9 or sorry, every 10 requests for exorcism, they only get like one approval. You know what I mean? Like the rest just end up trying to fend for themselves. I know that there are really psychiatric cases out there where people think that that sort of thing is going on. And then you have like the rare case where there are multiple people seeing strange things happening that are a little bit less explicable. This sounds like a case where, there was enough going on with this poor kid, especially with the one thing that always gets me about stories about exorcism. There's usually a component to the ones that are more credible that include not just physical changes in appearance, but also auditory changes in how the person sounds. There are so many examples of how people can change their voices under their own willpower because voice acting is a thing. You go watch any like professional video on how people do certain voices, like take the Simpsons for example. Like there's only a handful of people who do so many voices and they change them so well. That's definitely possible in adults. But the thing that gets me about this story a little bit, kind of irks me or just makes me a little uncomfortable, is the fact that this kid, he's 14 years old. His voice probably hasn't even cracked yet. But then, actually, hold on. He's probably getting to a point of puberty, right?
If not, he's already there.
He's already there. So, okay, well, maybe, okay, there's a little bit of doubt there. Explanation for why the voice was changing, or he was able to manipulate his voice in such a way. That's interesting, right? I do think that it is a little less likely that if the guttural noises this kid is supposedly making in a wide variance and difference like sounds, then I could see how that would elevate concern. That's what pops out to me, is the guttural noises and obviously the things flying across the room. But
one thing I wanted to point out as well is, prior to the family moving to St. Louis, I forgot to mention this, and I think it's important. The word Louis appeared in the scratches on the boy's rib cage, on Roland's rib cage.
Yeah, and not just the Lewis word, but supposedly he also, the kid Roland also had the name Bowdern etched into his skin at one point through unknown forces, which is a little weird, right? The demon is possessing you. It's crazy. Why would it choose to scratch the name of the location and also the name of the priest? I don't know. I don't know. I think that's interesting.
Maybe this particular demon, or as they say throughout the case, it was actually the devil, wanted an altercation with these specific priests.
Yeah, could be.
To challenge their faith. Who knows? We have the two priests that now are involved. They requested permission from the archdiocese. The evidence that they provided to the archdiocese was that they observed the bed shaking, flying objects, the boy speaking in guttural voices. As is tradition with every case of demonic possession, the people that are possessed have an aversion to anything that's holy. So whether it be holy water, a holy relic, a cross, anything, any type of religious artifact, they don't want to be near it. They can't stand being near it. That was the same case with Roland here. After they get the approval, now it's time for them to perform the ritual Romanum. So the exorcisms were conducted in multiple locations, including the family's home in Maryland, a relative's home in Missouri, and in the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis. So when they moved to St. Louis, it's not like they picked up and moved that they purchased a house. They were actually staying with relatives. So you had relatives that were there that were like, what the fuck is going on? They're witnessing all of this stuff going on too. It's not just, the family and the priest. You have other third party witnesses that are experiencing this along with them. The priests followed the ritual Romanum, the Catholic Church official guidelines for exorcism. This involved reading specific prayers, invoking the name of Jesus Christ, and demanding the demon leave Roland's body. During the exorcism sessions, Roland frequently resisted the rituals with physical aggression and verbal outbursts. He spat at the priests, he struck them, and he uttered profanities and phrases in unknown languages. Roland would scream and writhe in pain when holy water touched him or it was sprinkled in the room. At times, he reportedly mocked the priests by mimicking their prayers. Words and symbols appeared on Roland's skin often during or immediately after prayers. These marks were interpreted as signs of demonic activity. The priest reported a palpable sense of evil during the rituals, describing the atmosphere as very heavy and oppressive. During this spiritual battle and these prayers, they would invoke the Archangel Michael to come and be present during the rituals and assist them with casting out the devil.
One portion of the story that we left out that infatuates me the most is the moment where Roland, it seems like he comes back a little bit. He says, I open the window. Like he's like, I gotta do something, which is kind of weird to me. Like, why would you open the window when you know that this crap is going on? You don't want to like him to escape or like throw himself out. But apparently the reason why he asked to open the window was so he could throw up black bile. So this poor kid, lurches and basically pukes up what was described as a thick, viscousy black tar. And the reason I think that is worth mentioning and it stands out to me so much is that's one portion of the story, aside from things flying across the room and also like scratch marks in the kid. You have like a very clear indication that something physical is happening to the boy's body, because nobody just throws up black bile. There's portions of the story where like the priest walked into the room and they were met with some kind of sulfuric, acidy, terrible, wretched smell. But then I would immediately think like, well, if this kid's in psychiatric distress, no one's probably brushing his teeth. He's probably not taking care of himself and all this, potential medication and riding around. He's probably getting actual stomach acid coming up. So I could see how that would explain it. If you've never been in the presence of someone with like a psychiatric issue who's been committed or something, like I've worked in situations like that. I've been in hospitals and worked in situations like that. There is a very heavy smell of urine. And oftentimes there's also like a mixture of all kinds of other rancid smells. This poor kid who's been dealing with all this for months on end, I imagine it wouldn't be very easy to keep up hygiene with him. So that's kind of explainable. But just the last, I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, but like the black bile is what gets me a little bit. If it's true, I would think that if I saw someone who is supposedly quote unquote possessed throw up black bile, my first inclination would be I need to capture some of that because it needs to have some study done on it, because that's interesting as fuck. But then the second
Or
thing
it might be blood.
Yeah, exactly. I guess it could. Yeah, I guess. Well, okay. Yeah, if the kid was throwing up blood, then that's like a medical emergency, especially black blood, because that's coagulated blood, and that means that he had internal bleeding for a while. So yeah, that's
according to the vomit color chart, which I just pulled up because you mentioned black bile, and I was kind of curious if that meant
smart.
anything.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So throwing up black bile is a term that typically refers to vomiting that appears black in color, which is almost always a sign of internal bleeding in the digestive tract. So if he had no issues like digestive issues, because in all the research that I've done and documentaries that I've watched and, reading about this, they never really go into detail if he had like medical ailments. Annalise Michelle, that's the first thing they fucking talk about.
Yeah.
It's like she had medical and she had psychological issues. There was a
Right.
medical component to this. This story is interesting in the sense that it came about from grief, but I don't want to divert too much before we get to the end of what happens to Roland.
Right. Yeah.
At one point, they're doing the exorcisms. They ask the demon to name itself. They force an answer out of it because you have to clean name it by name. I may be wrong in this. JJ, correct me if I am. Call it out by name and you cast it out in the name of God, in the name of Jesus. We've mentioned before that this demon had identified itself as Satan. The climactic night comes on April 18th of 1949. It was during this night that Roland entered into a violent trance, during which he screamed, "Satan, I am Saint Michael. I command you to leave this body." According to witnesses, and after this declaration, Roland collapsed into stillnessness and appeared to be at peace. He later stated that he felt free from the presence.
Jeez, took a long time. Sorry. I'm not trying to be a smartass, but man, that's such a heavy thing for anybody to go through if this kid really did go through this stuff. But I mean, the last thing I'll say on the aspects of the story that have to do, obviously with the culmination of seeing Saint Michael and the flaming sword and all that stuff that supposedly happened. So it's clear that the kid had some kind of deeper understanding of religious iconography and like the Bible and stuff. So, I mean, I guess you could say like, well, if it really did happen, if there really is a Saint Michael and the Saint Michael really did help, then the kid wouldn't have had to have known that. It would just, be Saint Michael speaking through the kid. But if you're looking for a psychological explanation, the kid must have known about the story of the archangel and how the archangel could play into that. And that's a heavy concept and a series of concepts in like a progression of the story in Christianity that the kid would have to understand in order to reach that climax of like supposedly getting rid of the demon inside of his body. So like, yeah, I don't know. What do you think about that? What do you think about the kid screaming out or yelling out, referencing Saint Michael, and how does that fit into the iconography and the religious text of exorcisms and stuff like that?
Well, it would make sense because from a religious aspect, Saint Michael was the one that defeated Lucifer.
Okay.
So Saint Michael was the one that defeated the devil. So it would make sense as soon as the demon within him named itself as Satan for them to ask for the assistance of Archangel
Right.
Saint Michael
Yeah.
with regards to the story about the rebellion in heaven. After the exorcism is completed, Roland reportedly returned to a normal demeanor with no memory of the events, and all strange phenomenon ceased entirely. The priests ended up documenting the events in detailed notes, which were then later leaked and became primary sources for subsequent accounts. The Catholic Church maintained confidentiality about the case, emphasizing the importance of privacy and spiritual discretion. Not only did this exorcism take a toll on Roland, like we've mentioned previously, the people that do the exorcism, it takes a toll on them too. So Father Bowdern, he suffered physical injuries, exhaustion, and psychological stress during the week-long ordeal. He fasted and prayed intensively, considering the case a major spiritual trial. The family were not exempt from struggles as well. His parents were both emotionally and physically drained, often questioning whether the ritual would succeed. After this all was over, they moved multiple times to avoid public scrutiny and to escape the disturbing events. One thing I wanted to jump to real quick is obviously anytime you have a case like this, it's always subject to skepticism and is always subject to debate. From the skeptical perspective, Mr. Dean,
Yes.
what do you think?
I'm gonna wring my hands menacingly because I have been waiting for this moment. Okay. I am not trying to rain on anyone's parade. The Exorcist movie and all that, like the book and stuff, great piece of cinema. Freaky as hell. Like I love all
Great
that
piece
stuff.
of
I love.
cinema, great work of fiction.
Look, I think that there are things in this world that are inexplicable, and one of those inexplicable things falls in the category of possessions and exorcisms and stuff like that. But we've talked about it before in previous episodes where like you don't really know what's going on in those cases. It could be, for all we know, like we've said before, it could be some, million year evolved fourth dimension prankster teenagers, whatever that racist version of teenager is, coming down to earth, fucking with humans and taking on the form of like, hey, let's go down and mess with those humans and make them think that they're possessed by their devil. And it could be anything. Like, it could be tulpas. We've talked about tulpas before, where someone who's under emotional distress is manifesting physical changes, and this kid maybe just so happened to have a basis of not only new age spiritualism but Christianity that kind of merged into this kind of poltergeist-ish event where he was driving everything subconsciously. Maybe there really was no possession. Could have been a real possession. Here's my take. I'm so happy I get to address this, for me, the nail in the coffin for this whole story. Here's my bottom line up front. I think that what's going on in this case is you have a priest who at the time came across this story of this poor kid. Maybe there were aspects of it that were true. This kid really had psychological issues. He was a real kid and all this stuff. But I think maybe what's happening is the priest, who is one of the primary nodes of all this story coming out, was looking for a way to influence the rate of baptism and influence the belief in the Catholic faith. And the reason, I know that's a heavy drop, the reason I say that is because there's one part of the story we didn't mention, and that's where one of the priests, I think it was Bowdern, convinced Roland's father to do a baptism on him while he was supposedly possessed. And that's significant because
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, we forgot,
Yeah,
right?
because he was not baptized as a Catholic. Yes, you're correct.
Because he's Lutheran.
He wasn't
Okay,
baptized
but
as
not
a
under
Catholic.
Catholic. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
the Catholic rites.
That's a pinnacle portion of the story, talking about Ouija boards being involved. And, I believe that if this kid was real, I think that the aunt was real. I think the Ouija board stuff was real. I think like him reaching out, looking into new age spiritualism was real. But this really seems an awful lot like a way for certain, no, I'm not talking about the Catholic Church or like larger Catholic Church in general, but maybe some misguided priests in the movement saw an opportunity to kind of twist the truth a little bit, to kind of get people scared, to kind of get people away from spiritualism, away from using Ouija boards. And here's the last reason I think that. I was so curious about the hospital where Roland was supposedly taken to. We knew in the story where they moved him to a hospital that had a psychiatric ward, and he was taken to the floor above the psychiatric ward so as not to disturb the psych patients there through all this mess. And it's called Alexius Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri. Deeper research suggests that that is a Catholic hospital. So he wasn't taken to a general non-denominational hospital. He was taken to a Catholic hospital. And I think that, like, what better place to try to commit somebody and do all these supposed exorcisms than one that's ordained and driven by the Catholic faith. I think that based off of the fact that there aren't a lot of real accounts of what's going on, there's not a lot of real documented instances. All the information seems to be coming from like one or two sources. And even if you dig a little bit deeper, there are people, even priests, who touch this story. I think there was one that was interviewed in 2013 who was close to this, who basically said, like, yeah, could have been possessed, but I personally don't have the expertise to know for sure. So he was kind of walking it back a little bit. Like, he was kind of saying, like, I'm not so sure. So I think that the lack of sources and the fact that you have so many points where this could be an opportunity for some individual in the Catholic Church to kind of counter spiritualism, like draw more people to the Catholic faith in the 40s and 50s. That's my gut feeling. But that's not to say that this shit doesn't really happen. That's just what I think about this quote unquote true story about, or the real life exorcist.
Yeah. And what I'll say as my quick final word is that, one, this is potentially another lesson in don't play with things you don't understand when it comes to spiritualism and the occult.
Yeah.
Clearly, Aunt Tilly knew what she was doing. Clearly, Roland didn't know what he was doing, which led to the sequence of events that played out. But on the flip side, you have a teenage boy that was very close to his aunt. He is a lone child in the household, and the person that he is closest with suddenly passes away. And as a person that experienced death as a teenager with my grandparents, having people that you're very close to in your life quickly yanked away whilst you're still going through your developmental years is a psychological shock. It's an emotional shock. So there could have always been the possibility that the grief that he was feeling was manifesting itself in different ways. But folks, let us know what you think. Do you think Roland Doe was actually possessed by the devil? Or was this a case of a teenage boy that lost the closest person to him and he didn't know how to cope? Thanks for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most podcast platforms. Be sure to subscribe and share. Also, don't forget to give a follow on Instagram at twroadpodcast and follow my TikTok at twrpodcast. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.